So I did see that you were in your spot a year and a half now.
About, yeah.
You're executive
Yeah.
director. Were you executive director or anything before that?
No, no. I was a teacher.
Really?
I was a teacher. So my career is interesting. I was, kind of finishing up college and not quite knowing what to do. And one of my buddy's moms was a secretary, administrative assistant at an elementary school. And I was doing some substituting here and there. She's like, "You should apply to be a paraprofessional, which is like a support in classrooms." And I'm like, "Yeah, sure, why not?" So interviewed, got the job, and before you know it, I was a fifth grade paraprofessional. I supported a handful of students in a classroom, and I learned the ropes, right? So I was doing that for a while. The students I work with were ADHD, OHI, and didn't require tons of support, but it was fun. I got to be in a classroom and I got to enjoy kids, and I'm like, I kind of caught the bug there. And I ended up going to a middle school. Right after that, they offered me a job because they had insurance. And when you're like 23, 24, and you're kind of winding down, and this other job was, they didn't offer insurance. So I went there, and it was there where I spent about a year. I finished up my degree in history. And, I'm like, I'm going to be a history teacher. And that was kind of my goal. And I had a principal who pulled me aside. She's like, "You need to strongly consider special education." And yeah, sure. Oh, that's a good idea. I kind of like this. And went to a master's program and, finished my degree in a year and became a teacher. And, so I was a para for a handful of years while that was all going, and, jumped in my first classroom. I was a teacher for students with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And they also had, some other support needs. They a couple of them needed or used augmentative communication systems, AAC devices, which is communicating with picture exchange system that's called PEX, or like it was a high tech where they had like a Dynavox touch chat type system, looks like a tablet. And I really got into that, and I'm like, this is fascinating. And it was there where it was my first year, and I love my students, but I started kind of seeing the barriers that were around. My first classroom, we were located in a vocational wing of the building. There were two or three other teachers there in this little pathway. It was like kind of way in the other side of the school. And I had office dividers for classroom walls and a shower curtain for a door.
Wow.
And I'm like, this is like, and I don't necessarily think it's the school's fault, right? But that's the only space they had. And my students, some would bolt, they would run out of the room. I mean, they would get frustrated. They were loud, they were boisterous. Some had behaviors where they required supports like behavioral supports, where we had like plans in order, and I had to restrain kids at times too when they were I was certified to do so, but when they were flailing on the ground, hurting their heads, hurting others, and and it kind of like showed me that there's way more to the support needs of kids than I initially thought. It wasn't just being the good teacher and building relationships. It was just how your classroom's set up, what type of supports are needed in terms of your occupational therapy, your OT, your speech, your PT. And a lot of my students, they weren't in general education classrooms. We were in this room for most of the day. One kid would have a job here and there. Another kid went to the school had like vocational wing, so they did a job in one of the vocational classes. But I felt like they needed more. I ended up getting a bus driver's license, and
Oh my goodness.
and the school had a bus that anyone could take. So I got licensed. So I started driving around the community, and you just had to do what you had to do,
Yeah.
right? And from there, I was starting to kind of think, there's a lot that needs to be done, and in terms of just how other students perceive your kids, and how other teachers, like they, even just talking to some teachers, like, we don't even know what you do. Like, what do you teach? I'm like, I teach everything, like whatever my kids need, I would teach them. And, I got a little bit frustrated because, there's a lot of limits, there's a lot of people around, they would observe you and give you feedback, but which is fine, but I didn't necessarily think that the feedback was always, I don't want to say effective. It was like critical in ways that weren't really based around my kids and how I was doing. There was like, you're ruffling people the wrong way. You're being too enthusiastic.
Oh
like
no.
little things. Like I asked the supports in my classroom to wear sneakers, because we did a lot of walking,
Yeah.
and like wear something that you're gonna get. We were outside a lot. We were doing all these different things, and there was a bathroom in the area. I wanted that bathroom just for students. I didn't feel like my students needed to wait in line for a bathroom. And there's a lot of other teachers and staff there. I'm like, no, that should be just for kids. They could go around the hall. My kids sometimes needed it right then.
Right.
So I was told I was ruffling people the wrong way and I was being too enthusiastic. So, you could sit back and kind of take it. So the next day I applied for a doctoral program, and I got in. So, ended up starting a doctoral degree. And that took a long time, but it was frustrating because I always would see my students just limited. They weren't allowed to do this. They were told that there was a different dance for them. They couldn't go to prom, and
Oh.
I'm like, well, yeah, no, we're going to prom. I'll make it work. We ended up taking two of my students to prom. I found them dates. I went myself. I brought their favorite. I know. Hi.
Sorry, this is Inky. He's been on almost every
What's up,
episode.
Inky?
He's such a friendly kitty.
That's all good.
Yeah.
But yeah, so like, take them to prom, take them to like, any event they wanted to go to, and then we'll come back. Well, we need support needs for these after school events, and that costs money. And there's all these like just different barriers kind of all around. So I was there for a couple years and ended up getting recruited by what's called a private provider. They do community-based programming. I know. Love it. They did like it's essentially where students with disabilities go after they leave high school when they age out of the system. And in New Hampshire at that time it was age 21. They would transition to adult services, which could be a variety of things.
Yeah.
And all the way up to 70, 80 years old. Like it provided that whole rest of your life. And there's a lot of different options. There's independent living. We could get into that in a minute, but worked there for a while, and it kind of gave an open canvas, right? Like you could do anything you want, and also tying it back to community and inclusion, which are things I always valued. Working, having employment, what does that look like? It's not just working; it's being part of like your. I know you're gonna be right. Like being like part of your staff, being part of the workplace. You go to the Christmas parties, you do like just like there's so much that comes with just being employed, right? That we don't really think about. And so I was there for a while, and then at that point I'm like you kind of want to try something different. So I went back to teaching and ended up working at a school, high school, and I was in the emotional disability class, which was a whole different form of disability.
Right.
Now, kids that were that had difficulty with trauma or anger, or were identified with an emotional disturbance, which is the IEP would say. So we were kind of like a fire station. When kids needed to leave classroom and vents, they would come to us, or we would go to them if there was a situation. I've seen kids get arrested. I've seen kids struggling in their classrooms and at home. So you were kind of like the emotional support, but you teach them the regulation skills. So I know you really like this microphone, but and that was great. I spent about 5 years there, and gave me a whole different perspective on disability and supportive education. And at 5 years, I'm like, okay, I kind of want to do something different. And I kind of stumbled on this able job. So I think a lot of people in the nonprofit worlds, they come from other nonprofit worlds, but I was a complete outsider. I went from literally 1 week in the classroom, 2 weeks later, I'm now the executive director of Able New Hampshire.
I almost feel like by listening to your story, though, they got the right person,
I hope so.
right? Because I have never heard anybody being too enthusiastic.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess you could, like, hey, that person's over the top, but it sounds like you were just super passionate.
I mean, there were things that I pushed the limits on, and I always felt like I was doing things for the right reasons. I had a student, and she was struggling just with communication, expression, and am I allowed to swear?
Yes,
Awesome,
please.
awesome. So like part of the things that she would do is she'll give me the middle finger and run away.
Yeah.
So programmed on her tablet a screw you button
Yeah.
with the middle finger on it, and that was a game changer for her. Like, it's age appropriate. She's 17 years old, 18 years old, to tell somebody to screw off. Like, every other kid has that word in their language, but it's the consequences that come with it. You have the freedom to express yourself in any way you want, but just because you have that freedom, you also have the ability to handle the consequences after.
Oh,
So like, I would
absolutely.
do things like, I never treated my kids like they weren't capable of doing something. I always try to push them, and things like that I think kind of ruffle people the wrong way. But I always felt like it was for the right reasons. So
You want to give them everything that they
yeah.
deserve, right?
And it comes back to natural consequences. Like, you could tell your boss, screw you, but at some point you're going to have to deal with the consequences, but you have the ability to do so. And these communication systems specifically, like, you should be able to say anything you want. It's literally your voice.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, we talk about free speech all the
Yeah.
time and everything else. So you're over at Able, New
Yeah.
Hampshire, and I do know some of the New Hampshire like organizations, like community partners and those kind of. I talked about it with Shauna, which was a fantastic episode. It was eye opening for me because I do have disabilities, but I'm still ableist. I haven't programmed my head, like, I mean, not like on purpose or
Yeah.
anything, but like as somebody that doesn't know how to like handle disability my own,
Yeah.
and like I just try to be kind, right? I try to give everybody what they need. Like, I
Yeah.
don't treat people different, just because you might be in a wheelchair or you have
Yeah.
something else ailing you. So it's kind of fascinating. Like, even though I do have disabilities, I never think of myself as like needing, like, obviously those programs and stuff. So
Yeah.
when I hear your story, is just absolutely wild, to go from the classroom to the executive director.
Yeah.
And I feel like it was a fairly short like stint, right? Like you're not that old.
I hope so. I mean, I'm 42, or 41, going to be 42. And I mean, it just kind of worked out the way it did.
No, it's
right?
beautiful, because we want people
Yeah.
like you in those positions. And you guys are a nonprofit.
We're a nonprofit. We're a 501c3. Yeah.
I want to ask, what is like the hardest thing about doing what you do?
Oh, time management. That's hard. I there's and especially with disability, when you look at a lot of other nonprofits, they could really focus in on 2, 3 issues, maybe 4, maybe 5, but disability intersects with so many things. And, for a lot of people, all of them are priorities. You can't tell me Medicaid isn't a priority for this person while education's not a priority for this other person. Or what we focus in on ABLE are barriers for inclusion, things that prevent you from participating in communities. So that comes with housing, transportation. We're really focused on oral health care. And there's just all these different areas. So I think, for me, I like being able to focus on lots of things. I don't get bored with 1 or 2 different topics, but also it strains you because there's just so many hats you have to wear. Like, some days I'm literally in a meeting for a couple hours, on education. Then I got to shift hats and wear a hat about housing. And then I'm jumping into housing meetings. And then maybe at the end of the day, I'm shifting hats and talking about oral health care.
Yeah.
So, there's just different levels to it. I think that's been my biggest challenge, is, focusing on just a select few, master of many, whatever the expression
Yeah,
is.
absolutely.
But, I think that was tricky. The other thing that's interesting about ABLE, when you look at all the disability nonprofits in New Hampshire specifically, most of them are state and or federal funds, and
Yep.
they provide services, right? So, you have the area agency systems, then you have the Parent Information Center, the PIC, and there's so many. Brain Injury Association, Northeast Deaf and Hard of Hearing, Future Insight. You can keep listing, but they're all service providers, and they receive federal government funds. And where ABLE is different is we don't, and purposely, because we want to have the flexibility to be critical of the systems without having to have the restraint of funds. So
That's very smart.
It is, and this was like that before Able, before I came onto Able, but it's designed that way, and
So nobody can put you on a leash.
yeah,
Yeah.
and we know the system doesn't work, and we need to be look at it with that critical lens, and we have the freedom to do so while other organizations don't. So we also partner very closely with the Disability Rights Center of New Hampshire, the Developmental Disability Council of New Hampshire, and the UNH Institute on Disability. And they do great work, but they can't always get out front on and be that like big voice on some issues, but they have their role because they produce tons of research, the legal backgrounds, people have complaints legally about issues that they're seeing. They're on that air. We can't do that.
Right.
The research that the IOD collects is amazing, but we could take that research and like, wow, okay, here are the patterns that we're seeing. We need to make these changes, and let's go make those changes. And we also have the flexibility. And one of the things that we're trying to do, the disability world's often very siloed and isolated. We use the word siloed a lot. And even within our disability community, we're siloed within that, So we have, I was just at a conference for Northeast Deaf and Hard of Hearing, which is a fantastic organization. They provide deaf and hearing services, interpreters, education for families, early intervention. But they might see problems, right? That we need more intervention at the younger ages, but they're so busy and they're so stuck with what they have to do, which is a service that people need.
Oh, absolutely.
But they can't go out there necessarily. I don't want to call them on the bus or anything because they're great, but they can't be upfront with a lot of these things. But ABLE was designed to be that advocacy arm within the disability world. And we could be that outspoken voice. We could, we're primarily member driven
Yeah.
and, advocate driven. So if there's an issue and people want to focus on it, as long as it's within our, our mission and what we want to do, like here, we'll give you the resources and the setup and infrastructure. Let's run with it.
How old is Abel?
It's our 18th birthday, so we're allowed to vote now.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Well, hopefully you guys will vote this year.
Right.
We need everybody.
Right. So we were started 18 years ago, 19 years in the fall. And
Okay.
it started with, there's a program through the IOD that's called the Leadership Series. Shauna went through it. I went through it. And as graduates left that program and they wanted a centralized location for their advocacy work. And that's kind of where it stemmed from.
This is a little side, but it just popped in as you said that. Is there a path if somebody was a young person right now and they're watching this and they're like, I want to work in disability justice.
Yeah.
I want to be on that path for advocacy. Like, what would you suggest to that person? Like, how do you find your way there? Because your story is completely like, I would never think you would wind up there. But from your perspective, how does somebody get there?
So it's recruiting. We have community organizers, and it's conversations. Like, I think a lot of times, disability could feel very lonely, right? And, when we start having that conversation, like, no, you're not the only one that's feeling this, or you're not the only one seeing this. So let's build something. Like, just yesterday, one of our members, he's amazing. He was talking about Social Security, and, he wants to work more, but if he works more hours, he loses his benefits.
It,
So he's like, that's a huge problem for me. And he's not the only one. So gather people that have similar problems. And then we start trying to map out what we can do to fix it. So, but every problem is unique. And, where you are in the state, it's a state that struggles with equity all across the board. Families are struggling with equity in their education system. So, every problem's a little bit different, but there are commonalities that we try to like highlight. And then, we have the way we are structured. We have task forces for a handful of topics that we have a mission driving it. So like housing right now, we want to really focus in on. This water.
Oh no, he's fine. Sorry, I think he's attention starved this morning.
I know.
So he had an eye infection. I had to bring him to the vet yesterday, and he got his shots and everything. I just think he's just so enamored. This is the first time he's been this enamored, but yeah,
it's all good. We have a drive to like focus on things, and that's the other part of the job. We do need funds, and we need funds to operate and do our work. So finding grants and resources could be a challenge, but we focus on um, organizations that agree with our mission, and we work with them. And so we're funded right now with Eastern Bank for our housing work, CareQuest oral health care for our oral health care work, and developing those relationships and kind of moving from there. But there are also some topics that are not funded, but we still want to focus on. So like our transportation work isn't funded.
Mm.
But we're doing trainings on how to access transportation, the stuff that we have right now that's available. And you go to the gas station right now, gas is super expensive. So
Very much so. Yeah.
the transportation is going to cost more and more. So now we're going to see more and more barriers. So really we're trying to get up front in some of these issues, being aggressive. But a lot of our work too is being unfortunately defensive. There's a lot of things that we're pushing back on. There's a lot of bills that were really alarming for us this year. Things ranging from increasing of seclusion and restraint for discipline in schools. There was one bill we were focused on in education too that wanted to consolidate services within multiple school districts. So schools from region could have one building where they would get all their services, which to us is an institution. Which and just pushing back on ableism in that way. There's a lot of different things that we're worried about. So we do spend a lot of our time pushing back, but we also want to start re-energizing and pushing forward on things that we want to see better. And we are a disability justice organization. So the way I view disability rights and justice, rights are the rights that we have right now that we fought for, that we want to make sure that we're not going to lose. Justice are the rights and responsibilities that we don't have yet. So we need to start pushing for more things that we get towards.
Yeah. You probably have quite a bit on your hands, especially with our state government and now our federal government. They must be keeping you absolutely busy, like just trying to fight for like special education funding and everything else.
Yeah.
It's got to be tough just legislatively to be up there constantly against all these bills, and people probably don't understand the disability world and everything else. So
we push back as much as we can. I think like at the federal level, it's scary. We have a president right now who's saying a lot of horrible things to a lot of communities, and ours too.
Yeah.
And too long ago where he just said, if you have a learning disability, you shouldn't run for president. Like, how demoralizing is that? And then
Completely.
we have, Kennedy. I wrote an article about this last year, but he's out there saying, autism's caused by Tylenol. It's perpetuating this belief that autism is, a deficit, and we need to cure it. So if you're autistic, like imagine hearing that. And and also if you have a kid that's autistic, there's a long history in our country of blaming mothers.
Yeah.
From 50s and 60s, refrigerator moms were initially the ones that they were called because you're being too cold to your kids, and that's why they're having autistic tendencies. And then it went from there to vaccinations, and then it went to Tylenol. So there's just this long period of just like blaming moms for their kids' disability, when in reality, like the disability is more impactful when their supports and services are not available.
Do you think it's anti-mom or anti-woman?
Both.
Yeah, because I feel like obviously you got to be a mom to have a kid. Right? Well, I mean,
Yeah.
if you're gonna have a baby, right? But like RFK, I didn't even consider him up front. Like we were gonna get to him after, but like now that you said that, he really is out there decimating communities. Maybe that's the wrong word, because
There's a lot of words you
I'm
could use.
I'm really fortunate that we have Europe, to kind of come in. I don't know if you saw this, but the other day, it was Denmark or Netherlands
Yeah.
did the study saying Tylenol did not link to autism.
Yeah.
But it's too late because it's already out in the American population. Do you think people really take those words serious? Yeah.
I mean, there was a hearing we had this year. We have an amazing policy director, Kristen Evans, that spends a lot of her time at the State House pushing back. She was at a hearing, and there was a bill that we were promoting. It was about making sure autism data was kept private and not given to federal organizations.
That's right. They wanted to do the federal registry.
Yeah, well, and so things like that, like we're nervous about, and and we're pushing back on. So like New Hampshire has a long history of freedom of information from both sides. Not left and right. And one of the questions she received was, if you could cure autism, would you?
Oh, I saw this. Yes.
And it's like, what do you say to that? And you're in a situation where, like, you want to be appropriate and you want to be respectful, but you hear such nonsense. It's like,
Do you think that wording is intentional, or were they just ignorant? Because like I feel like I'm ignorant, but I wouldn't make that mistake.
chicken or the egg?
It's yeah. All right, I got you.
I think one of the things that drives able, we don't view disability as a deficit. We view it as a form of diversity. The
Yeah.
deficits are how our societies are set up. And when we have the supports and we have the infrastructure, like, our think about schools for a second. Like how many schools were built in the 60s and 70s?
A lot.
Most of them,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Were they built with disability in mind? No, they were built before, IDEA. They were built before the Americans with Disability Act. They didn't have disability in mind back then. So we have this whole infrastructure just physically, and then how we set up our society itself, built without disability in mind. And then we're trying to squeeze so many people into this system. It's not built that way, right? So I think there's a lot of, and that's where we push, right? We need to make those changes so that so disability community can thrive in any setting we get into.
Yeah. With you being in disability justice,
Yeah.
do you have like one, two, maybe even top three like wins that you guys have had in recent years at all that you could think of? And if you want to think about that for a bit, you can.
Yeah.
But
And in terms of the state, before I got to ABLE, like the people, my predecessors, they worked really hard on oral health care. And prior to work, Medicaid wasn't accepting for dental care other than emergencies, teeth pull and extractions and things
yeah.
like that. Now you could receive Medicaid and get dental hygienist and things like that, like basic cleaning.
Oh, that's actually good to hear.
Right, because oral healthcare is healthcare, and I think we always think like it's not just cosmetics; it ties directly to your heart and other areas of your body.
Yeah.
So that was a huge win. I think, I'll have to think about that more. I guess I'm always I don't know. I'm always guilty of being a critic. I feel like there's so much more we need to do. But we did have some wins. We are growing advocacy. We are joining in spaces that weren't necessarily spaces we've been in before. And I think that's where the power of ABLE could really be, is that we're known in the disability world, but we want to be known in all the different communities, because disability intersects with, race, ethnicity, LGBTQ issues, and, so many different aging,
Yeah.
healthcare. There's so many different components to it. Like, and we need to make sure that we're part of all these conversations. So we want to grow advocates, not to just be in the disability community. We want advocates that have disabilities being part of all these communities. We want representatives in the state house. We want people at their town councils with disabilities. We want people that are attending New Hampshire housing meetings that have disabilities. And it's not up for, ABLE can only do so much, but we could train and educate so people could be in these conversations. I think we're winning that one. Still lots of places we need to go and lots of growth, but we're heading in the right direction.
I mean, it's powerful to have an organization like yours out here. When I think about disability, you think like, oh, you're born with that,
Yeah.
right? And you don't often think about, as you age, you're gonna gain disabilities potentially, right?
Everyone does. Most of people do,
Yeah, I mean, I was a very healthy young man, had no issues. Now I'm deaf in my left ear. I have Meniere's disease, and other things that, that I've gotten through military service and
Yeah.
everything. And I never thought I'd be disabled. I still don't even think of myself as disabled, but I am. I can only hear half my world. I get vertigo. I experience these things. And so disability has kind of been a little bit on my radar, not necessarily because I'm looking for help, but I think it should be part of the conversation as we age, especially.
It needs to become more normalized.
Yeah.
It's always viewed as, and even just look at education, right? What do we call disability support in education? We call it special.
Yeah.
And what the term used to be called, they changed it, but we still use it every now and then. But if a student comes in and they require a lot of support and you request aid from the state, it's called catastrophic aid. So how we're actually defining it and viewing it as a special thing that could be catastrophic, the language that we use impacts how we view it. And, and I like to put, it this way, like, what makes your needs more special than my needs? Like, you could ask my wife, I need constant reassurance. I need constant, like, attention. Why is that less special than somebody that needs support to, access, a building, or to help with their employment? Like, what makes mine any more or less special, or theirs more or less special? It's just, we all have support needs in some way. You saying you just need support needs. You need some accommodations that could help you access what you need. It's yours might be a little bit different than mine or somebody else's, but it doesn't make it any less or more important.
I agree with that. We all have something that drives us, like whether it's a disability or mental,
Yeah.
physical, anything.
Yeah.
Like that's what makes human beings special.
Mhm.
We are so diversified, and we need everybody.
Yeah.
I think it's important because we can understand these things and how they affect, our species, our generations, medically. There's so many things that come out of this,
Yeah.
like, and I get sad sometimes. I think about cultures like Korea that will like abort a pregnancy because there's a possible complication, and it's unfortunate because we don't know. There's so much we don't know, and we want to give these people a chance and let them enjoy life and give them the things that they need. When I was a kid, I remember all the awful things they used to say about the special education
Yeah.
kids. As they go into the trailers, for additional room because they couldn't be in traditional classrooms. Has that changed a lot from your view? Because I haven't been in school like 30 years, so I don't know. Have we
Um,
gotten better, I guess, is the question.
Depends on where.
Where? Here in
Um,
New Hampshire, maybe?
like, so there's still that stigma, right?
Yeah.
And actually that was a lot what my dissertation was about. It was about autistic college students as they reflected on special education, how it forms their identity. And, some of the takeaways I got from that was, you're put in sped classrooms, a
Yep.
resource room. You really, you're put there. And a lot of kids, they don't necessarily understand their disability, what it means. One person in particular in my study, they weren't told they were autistic until, like, high school. So it's always this like quiet negative thing. But like, if you start promoting at a younger age, you start kind of having more just understanding, and I don't want to say acceptance, but just like, this is part of who you are, and this is how it affects you. Just like, hard time hearing in certain ways, you got to do it. Like, it's a little bit more obvious, right?
Yeah.
But we had, and I struggle with this too. Like, my classroom was, set to the side, and some kids didn't want to go in there because they didn't want to be labeled as being one of those kids. Some schools have trailers still. I'm sure they do. I don't know for
Probably.
sure, but I wouldn't doubt it.
Yeah.
But there is a lot of research that the more students are included in the general ed classrooms, it benefits the students being included, but it also benefits the whole student body. Students actually all around actually improve their scores, testing scores, and get better grades, and are more accepting human.
I could see that.
So, there's a lot of benefits to it. And I think right now, special education is so, I was really frustrated with that component of it. Is it's so focused on uh, legal process and making sure every dot is checked. It's very compliance driven.
Yeah.
Where it really it's because it's a whole thing. Like, it's separate from education. It's this legal document. And rightfully so, there should be, laws and restrictions, and making sure you get those services because, you're right.
They're people. They need that.
Yeah.
They deserve that.
But some supports are more expensive than others.
Oh, absolutely. I've heard like, districts having to spend up to $1 million, in a year for a special needs, situation like that. And in my mind, I'm like, let's pay it. Like, what do you like? There's no question here.
Yeah.
It's just, where do we get that funding?
It's tough because you can't actually say no.
Yes. Right.
It's
Right.
illegal to say no because when you go into a meeting, it's what the student needs to access the general education curriculum or their academics, right? And when you start defining it by numbers, now all of a sudden it becomes a numbers game, and you're not thinking of the student. But it also, like, justifiably, the special education costs have skyrocketed.
Yes.
And people are getting frustrated. And some of the things I've seen with that are people calling out students with disabilities as being the price drivers. We can't have sports now because this student needs a nurse. We can't do this now because that student does this. There's one town that, someone on their budget committee said that we need to put a no vacancy sign up for special ed because it's costing too much. And these are students we're talking about, and it's their right to have this stuff and the supports they need just to be part of the school community.
You're right.
And it's having this battle. But historically, IDEA, the special education law for our country, has never been fully funded by the federal government. It's supposed to be around 40%. It's been maybe 13, 14%. So like, where's the federal government here helping support these students? There's also a significant lack of special education teachers. You could pull up ed jobs right now, and you'll find plenty of openings. It's not hard to find a job. It's a very demanding job. When there's openings, you have somebody else now covering more of a caseload. Then it becomes more compliance driven, and less time with the student, more mistakes. And other positions, speech and language, OT, paraprofessionals, they're fewer and further between. And we're seeing a lot of private companies coming in right now, kind of filling that demand. And then you're starting to see the prices increase. I'm not saying that's the whole reason why it's increasing.
No, it's very similar to like traveling nurses,
Yeah.
where you can't fill your own slots, so somebody else will come in and assist you for X amount of dollars. Oh, that's dangerous.
And it's fulfilling a need.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thankful that it exists, but for the rest of us, that's a dangerous hill to climb. Uh, wow, I did
Yeah.
not realize that was happening. I'm a little heartbroken sometimes because when I go into like Facebook groups and stuff, especially in the last like 6 months to a year with all the
Yeah.
bills going through and everything, I'm seeing like fully brain formed adults saying things like what you had just said. We need to get rid of special needs. Like, we're paying X amount of dollars. What's the budget for this? Can't we zero it out? Like, and it's breaking, that somebody in my community feels that way about the children in our community. And then he or she feels comfortable out there saying that,
That's the alarming part.
right?
Yeah.
There's just so many bad pieces to that. But I like what you're saying, because if we start, like, the best time to start is now.
Yeah.
The best start was yesterday, but if you can't, I mean, I'm messing that up. But the point
I
is,
get it, yeah.
like, you have to start somewhere. And if you integrate those kids in the school early, with the rest of the population, then hopefully you don't get full-fledged adults making those comments 30 years later on Facebook, because they're like, wait a minute, I was with this person. This is a friend of mine. I get this.
And it's tricky too, because I think, since disability affects so many communities, it could happen to anybody. And like, most people know somebody that has significant support needs. They know them at the grocery store. That might be a relative.
Sure.
And there is a lot of, even when you are close with somebody, there's still a lot of perceived ableism with that too. Like, well, they can't do that. They could only do this. And so it is something that we're seeing, but it's exceptionally disheartening. But I also see that it's coming from a perspective of, the budgets are just really outrageous right now. And it's making people say things out loud that, and they're feeling enamored to do so. And they shouldn't be saying it. But at some point we need to also, like, we need to look at the budgets of these towns and, find ways. And I think it's so frustrating because, especially within my town, we're seeing these costs rise, every town in New Hampshire, but we're not looking north towards Concord and seeing, like, well, what are they actually doing to kind of help decrease these prices?
Yeah.
And some of their ideas to do so have been very dangerous. That's when we got the consolidated services. Just recently, there was one where, you want to use, sure you use your private insurance to pay for the supports that you need in school. So, like, the solutions that they're coming up with are very dangerous and potentially illegal. That could cost your school money with the legality perspective of it too.
Sure.
So it is a very dangerous game, and people are saying some horrific things online.
I think we get lost in New Hampshire with the EFAs,
Yeah.
and excuse me, and some of the other things that are coming out of Concord,
Yeah.
right? I mean, I agree with you. Every session since I've lived here, they just dump awful bills.
Yeah.
And there's usually 1,000 every year that they have to sort through, which is an enormous like load for everybody to sort through and figure out, okay, which ones do I fight with? Which ones do I not? Like, all that. And yeah, they don't fund us, but it's not just schools that they're not funding. They're not funding things across the board. And I didn't even really think about the special education part, or probably not just like kids, but like adults and programs. And
There's a lot of errors. Yeah.
how many, I don't expect you to actually know this number, but maybe you have a better gauge than I do. How much disability like affects New Hampshire as far as like, do we have a lot of disabled people in New Hampshire that are dealing with issues? Is this a major part of our community and our everyday that people need to get out and get behind?
Absolutely. I don't know the specific numbers, but I think, I got to write them down because I get this question a lot, but it's about 1 in 4 are impacted in some way. And there's, outside of education, there's the whole adult Medicaid system, right?
Yeah.
And that even comes in different levels. There's the BDS component to it, adult services, and then there's people that are on disability that need other supports, but not necessarily, BDS supports. And then you have housing, you have transportation, you have, there's just so many things that could come into it. So, and communities, so many different communities that intersect with it. So it's just one of these things I don't think that we're focusing enough on. And, we there was last year, there was potential 10% cuts across the board with disabilities, right? But for BDS, adult service Medicaid, that was a big thing. And the disability community showed up. If you look at the hearings and the budget hearings, you can see usually the disability community shows up in pink. And it was like every other person was talking about disability and what these supports mean. And it's amazing when the community comes together.
That's heartwarming.
It is. And it's heartwarming at the same time. It's also like discouraging. Like, I can't believe we have to do this again.
Oh well, yeah, yeah, from that
Like,
perspective. But I'm glad that people will come out and be a
yeah.
part of that conversation.
And, it gets, one of the other areas, it's like, okay, so we fully fund it. Doesn't mean that we have the most appropriate staff either. That's a whole other conversation, right? Direct support, people that support adults with disabilities in the system, at home or at different programs or employment. Huge need in our state, huge need. And they make around 14, $15 an hour. I mean, when I was working at a vendor, I just so maybe like 7, 8 years ago, started off people at $11, $12 an hour. You're driving people throughout your community, wear and tear on your car. It's an exceptionally challenging job, mentally, physically, at times. You're pretty much taking care of somebody's life and also doing it in a way where they could thrive in their community. I'm not sure if you followed some of the New Hampshire Bulletin articles recently, but there's a lot of neglect and abuse and death within the disability system. William Skipworth from the New Hampshire Bulletin, he had like a whole series back in November where people were being beaten and kicked and hit with, in their residential homes. There was
By caretakers?
there was somebody that was locked in a car for a prolonged period of time and died. And another person like kind of left their home through a window and was found in the woods dead the next morning. And these are just the ones that were documented from 5, 6 years ago. A couple of weeks ago, there was, a significant amount of neglect and abuse coming from June through December in the disability. I get chills thinking of it.
Yeah, me too. You hear a lot about like elderly people being neglected in assisted living homes and stuff like that, but you don't necessarily hear about this in particular. And I don't think I saw this bulletin. So
Yeah.
please tell me there's consequences. Somebody had to be arrested and go to jail for this, right? Like this, tell me this hasn't been unanswered.
It's being answered in a systematic way, but the question is, what's the best way to answer it? So there's a bill right now, SB 670, that's hoping to address some of the issues, but it's gonna be a lot of work. I don't think people know the full extent of it. What was really kind of nerve-wracking was, when I saw the articles, I wasn't necessarily surprised either. I don't think anyone was. I think it was kind of a quiet secret that people knew, but just didn't know the extent of it. People were shocked but like families and people, like as they're entering the system and they see this, it's like, this is why I don't want my kid and I don't want them to be going through the system. So when we're talking about supports, like, these are staff members.
Yeah.
And we could talk about background checks and one, there's a lot of improvement we need to make with that, but life and death, right? Like, are police being aware? And if people were more in their communities, if someone's being abused, like you would think you would be able to, if you had a friend that was being abused, you would think you'd probably pick up on that because you see a change in demeanor. But when people with disabilities are isolated, you
They,
don't see them.
they tend to pull back, don't they? Or, well, I mean, I guess it depends
Well,
on your disability
it
and like your
depends. Like
situation.
if you're
Right?
an
So,
adult with intellectual disability being supported, in a home by staff, and how often do you get out? How often do you access community? Do you have a job? Are your coworkers seeing that? If not, like, and you could be very isolated,
oh,
and you might not be able to pick up on some of these things. So that's a huge thing that
your organization intervenes in situations like this,
we don't
or
have the
not?
legal,
Okay.
like, so right now the Disability Rights Center is doing they're doing some work behind the scenes, looking at where the system has failed. But there's also a quality council, which I'm a part of, is looking at the systematic review of all the various players, like private providers and just all the different levels. Is a monthly meeting. The next week's is next one, and kind of seeing from their perspective how this could have happened. So I'm glad the articles came out because it is making people like react. People are aware of it and they're doing some things. The people that were responsible, I can't, I don't know the specifics. The individuals and those stories came out in November, but the issues came 4 or 5 years ago. So, there's more focus on that now. And I don't know the legal happenings, but I think even police officers and local municipalities, I don't think they fully understand disability either. So when they do get calls, who are they going to talk to? Talk to the staff members? Are they going to talk to the person themselves? And that person has a disability that might need communication support. But how can they communicate effectively to a police officer if they're in danger? So I think that's where, as a system, and this is where ABLE wants to jump more in, is how do we provide that advocacy training so that you can speak out and know your rights more? And some people are really good at it, but I think there's a lot of people that shown how to, like, if you don't have the ability to call. I'm thinking of one of my students, in the past, like, she wouldn't have the ability to call 911 and say my staff is hurting me. That's not something that she would be able to communicate
Which makes
in
sense.
that way.
Yeah.
But she would be able to communicate it, and all of a sudden you see an increase in her like frustrations and behavior. She would come out and probably come in that way. And if you're in tune and you have good support that's outside of that, like, yeah, wow, what's really going on? Something needs to be explored. And but I think that's where our systems really kind of, not just the developmental system itself, but just our society needs to kind of pay more attention.
Because your advocacy and what you do is so important and it affects so many people, I would imagine that you're heavily involved with like the politics side
Yeah.
and like and all that. Do you guys endorse politicians? How far do you get involved with like either like partisan or do you try to like just testify at Congress? Like what is your involvement with Concord, I guess?
So, Kristen's our registered lobbyist, so she could work with legislators on bills, and she give very specific recommendations, or like, no, like this, or yes, we'd like it. I'm not, so I tend to do more educating.
Okay.
But in terms, like, disability has a long history of being bipartisan. We don't want to be a left or a right, Democrat or Republican section. IDEA was signed in 1970s. I believe that was Ford. ADA, George H.W. Bush, 1990. And, disability is not, it affects everybody in some way. So, we want to be more across the board and provide support. And I've had conversations with people on both sides of the aisle. We do have some legislators that we work to help with some of our bills that we want to see. We have closer relationships with some than others. But we do have friends on both sides. We have a yearly events that we have a disability legislator of the year. And, this past year was Heath Howard. Last year was Tim Horgan. And the year before that was Denise Ricciardi. So we have
All of them are great.
all of them are great. And, Denise has been really helpful with some of our at the Senate level, with some of the issues that we presented, like oral health care, and Horgan is really helpful, and he especially from the judicial perspective, 504 rights and things like that.
Yep.
And Heath is part of the community, and he sees it from a different lens, just sees the Medicaid system, he sees the struggle. And so we want to work with anybody. We don't necessarily always see it left and right.
Yeah, no, I was just curious because politics have shifted so much since the 80s and the 90s. The partisan politics are not the same. I mean, to some degree, but
Yeah.
I feel like there's a little bit more extremism.
Yeah.
And you could go both sides, I suppose, with that. But one particular side
No, I agree
is
with you.
cutting the budget and really making things harder. So I wasn't sure what your engagement level there was. I have never testified on disability bills. That's something
Not
that
yet.
I may, yeah, not yet, right? It's always not yet. I do testify, but I would testify on disability bills. I don't have an issue with that, because it does touch my life,
Yeah.
in multiple ways. Through family members that
Yeah.
maybe work in the communities and stuff like that. So, um,
There's a lot of bills out there too that don't necessarily look like disability bills, but when you really dive into it, they significantly affect disability. Like the open enrollment one, we've been very involved with that. And that one really alarms me. On paper, it doesn't seem like it. And the first draft, through it, it's like, okay, this doesn't really mention disability. And even, Senator Lang said in the hearing, I don't want to turn this into a large, special education conversation. That's for another day. But he was asked questions about 504 accommodations, which is different than an IEP. He couldn't answer it, and he couldn't answer, basic special education questions. And then I started doing more research into it, and I see what these other states have with open enrollment, and the ones that actually, regardless of the protections, the ones that have that track the data, states like Wisconsin, Oklahoma, and there's one more state.
unfortunately, I cannot help it.
I know.
This area.
I can pull it up on my phone real quick, but when they start tracking it, all of a sudden kids with disabilities are being denied their open enrollment at higher rates than kids without disabilities, and they're tracking them. These states are the ones that are tracking it. Colorado doesn't track, but there's a lawsuit in Colorado because more kids with disabilities are reporting that they're being not having access to it. So, and you hear the arguments, at the state house. It's like, well, this is gonna, everyone gonna take advantage of this. But we talk about EFAs, we talk about open enrollment, all the school choice stuff. There are some kids with disability. I'm not going to deny that they might take advantage of those programs, and the schools aren't working, and they will use those funds. But for kids that have disabilities too, like the funds that you would get from, let's say, an EFA would not cover the amount of support that you need and get by the school. If you get like $6,000 plus a disabling condition, which is a whole other thing we can get into. I hate the concept of that. But now all of a sudden you get $8,000. Well, how much is speech? How much is OT? How much are the resources? How much are these? Like, that's way more than that.
Right.
So like a lot of kids, like, you have this program that's supposed to, anyone could just, have the freedom to choose, but some kids don't have the freedom to choose because they will be losing out on their services if they went in that direction. And now you're starting to pull money from the actual towns, which, special education budgets we talked about are super expensive.
Oh, they can crush towns, especially the way we have downshifted,
Yeah.
Property taxes and
Yeah.
everything else to towns. Yeah, absolutely.
And now you're having these, you're not doing the what's the term, the more kids that have a teacher, all of a sudden it's a little bit cheaper,
Yeah.
So like now you're starting to pull funds, from other areas, and even just with one of the concepts, open enrollment, right? That's huge right now in our state. People are debating it, but fundamentally, any kid could go to any school that they want. And, how far away are you? I'm in Hollis, you're in Barrington. That's about an hour and a half away, right?
Yep.
Let's say a kid from Barrington wanted to go to Hollis school. Nothing denying that, right?
Right.
But they have significant functional needs, and they require transportation per their IEP. In Barrington, they get a transportation from their home to their school, but they want to go to Hollis. Now, Barrington, they get into Hollis. That student would have to drive all the way to Hollis every day and back.
Yeah, that's why I giggle. I was like, holy cow, that's like a 3-hour commute each day.
Yeah. And sometimes, you need the transportation, right?
Yeah.
Some kids require a paraprofessional in the car. So now you're paying for that. Like, this is like $200,000-$300,000 it could potentially cost. When normally, let's say a student lives in this neighborhood and there's one, another student a couple neighborhoods away, they could consolidate and then all go in together in one bus with the para their school. That's how it happens in your town now. But now that one student's going to Hollis, this other student's going to Oyster River. Now you have two transportations going in different directions.
Yeah,
It adds up.
that can get expensive quick.
It adds up.
Is there? I don't know how we get our heads around that. Well, I do, but nobody wants to have that conversation. We need to tax the rich. We need to fix our budget. We need to bring back I&D, tax. We need to bring all that stuff. But no.
And the federal government needs to pay their fair share of special education.
Yes, absolutely.
Like never got to 40%. That's a huge thing.
Our wealthy and corporations need to pay
money for bombs, but no money for support.
And it's so scary because right now everybody's trying to figure out like, well, how do we fix this revenue? Well, we know how to fix the revenue because they just took out revenue over the last few years that could be going to our school, that could be going to our needs that each town has. But we've chosen not to. We've chosen to take in less money. And now, because people are like running with their heads cut off, they're talking about income tax and sales tax. I get it. I get it. But I always say this, fix what we have right now before we get to that, because I don't think it's needed.
Yeah.
I think we can patch these in other ways. But I'm so scared about like the next budget and the budget after that, because we've seen schools, we've seen even adult programs, get reduced, and that's not helpful. Where do these people go? Where do they get help? I guess that's where you come in, right?
And that's where, November is going to be really important.
Oh, it's so important.
And, we don't endorse candidates, but, we do want people to see how, candidates in their town voted. You're spending all this time on anti-DEI initiatives and, some of these ridiculous bills. What they're not spending time on is how to decrease our property taxes, how to improve our education. They're pulling, but they're not actually fixing anything. They're causing a lot more problems. Like, even just the DEI conversations and the divisive concepts, right? Like, how much money have they spent? Legalities of it, and for these outrageous things, how do you not have diversity, equity, inclusion? And from a disability perspective, that's who we are.
Yeah, it should be a standard operating for anybody. So
yeah.
Why don't you endorse candidates? It's just because you're afraid of the friction since you work with both sides, or
501c3 can't.
Oh, you can't legally. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, it'd be nice, but
I don't know all the rules for all of them, but
there are. Yeah,
I got you. I'm just curious because, for what you do, I mean, who's in office has like such a huge impact, right? Like, it affects everybody.
And on a personal level, I endorse candidates.
Okay.
On a and for my town and part of the things that I do in my own time. But from an able perspective, I do think there's also some attacks on nonprofits, which could be kind of dangerous. That's going on right now.
Yes.
And not that I don't want to stay away from that. I'm willing to have that battle if we need to. But I do see the benefit of not necessarily as an organization supporting a candidate. I think there are, it gives us the freedom and flexibility. What if that candidate we support all of a sudden, like,
oh, that's true.
See it from both sides, right?
Yeah.
Like all of a sudden it's a big giant, like it kind of gives us away, but also it lets us work. Like, we want in an ideal world, right? And this is like the optimist in me. We want to work together. Like, we all have the same goals, left or right. We want a country and a community that thrives, that, independent, that we supportive of each other. I don't think that's a huge difference from both sides. How we get there is kind of where we get different. But we don't have tolerance for candidates that are going to be ableist or racist or things like that either. Like, we don't want to support candidates like that. There's so many bad things that are like being spoken out loud too. Like, it's disgusting.
Yeah.
I think even today's political culture, like, sensationalism sells. Right.
Yeah. All those clicks, and I agree.
I think we encourage that too.
It just feels like life has gotten away from us a little bit. People feel comfortable saying things they shouldn't, doing things they shouldn't. And it's just, I don't know. And with an advocacy organization, I just assumed you probably were pretty entwined with politics. And
We are.
especially this is the season right now where a lot of organizations are making those endorsements.
Yeah, and a lot of them are, caucuses and
Yeah.
things like that. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's just an interesting thing.
Yeah.
So, I mean, because all the bills are coming out, are you finding your time in Concord? Like, is it increasing? Are you going up there with your team, or anybody? Like,
So Kristen's up there a lot. I go up there I typically focus on mostly the education bills. So that's where I'm passionate about.
yeah.
Kristen focuses on pretty much everything else. But there are a lot of bills that were up there testifying for. I go up there maybe like once or twice a week to testify or to be a part of something up there. But being my position, it's harder, I think, because there's just so many, like I said before, like, I'm bouncing from like all these different areas, right? Like, so to kind of like pull away from some of the other work, like it's important to testify, but there's all the work that goes on behind the
Oh
scenes.
yeah.
And, one of the things I really want to focus on, and I was at a conference back in November, December, and what really kind of struck me was someone talking about education. And he's like, if you could have a magic wand, go into the moon effort, what do you want education look like? And I struggled with that.
It's a big question.
It is, but like, why are we not thinking that way?
True.
And why haven't I sat down? Like, where are we going? And I think so. And one of the things I really want to shift, not just Able, but any of the communities that we're a part of, like, where's the shoot for the moon for our, like, what we're trying to do? What's the ultimate goal here? And you can't just keep being defense. We can't keep going up there fighting back against these bills. And the sides that we don't necessarily agree on, especially in like education, some of the others, like they have a path, and our path can't always be, just give us more money, we'll make it better.
Yeah, the endless pit. Yeah.
And, I think that's part of that conversation, right? Like, what are our ideas? How are we going to improve it? One of the things, especially with education, and being a teacher, I have the firsthand background. Like, literally, I'm helping a kid learn Shakespeare at 7:30 in the morning after they just pounded a giant Monster Energy drink
Right.
in a building that's 70, 80 years old with heat that's barely working. They just had a giant Pop-Tart basements. Like, and and we're expected to that situation to be successful, like how we view an education,
Yeah.
like, is this the best plan that we possibly have? Like, does any of that make any sort of sense?
No.
And, and you can look at that from a lot of different ends, like, is this really what the best we could do? So what are the ideas to make, just our whole community and society improve, not just, these specific areas, right? Like we do have to start dreaming bigger and then finding a roadmap to those dreams and looking better into that.
Well, if you're doing that, like I know a lot of people like to do introspective, like
Yeah.
looking in, like what do we do here in New Hampshire?
Yeah.
But I mean, we are New England. We are a handful of states, small states.
Mhm.
I'd imagine they're just right over the border. Do you intermingle with their equivalent of your organizations, or do you really just stay within the borders?
I mean, honestly, not enough. I'll own that piece. And we probably should be doing better. But also, New Hampshire is so different than, look, our neighboring states, Vermont, Maine, and Massachusetts. So we're very different than all four. All of us are very unique in our own ways.
Yeah.
We can't copy what Mass does. We can't copy what Maine does, and we're looking at, like, so housing is a good example of this. We're looking to build more inclusive housing options for people with disabilities. Right now, we're finding that people are living isolated lives, and even the public housing, how does that support people with disabilities and things like that? And we're seeing a lot of organizations coming up, and I'm not saying that they're wrong, but they're primarily people with disabilities living under one roof with the staff, which we don't necessarily view as inclusion. But I also view that as a necessity of the situation because there's so many families right now that are desperate for housing that this is just the best solution that they could come up with
Right.
because there's nothing else being made. So we look at like some of these other models in California and Maine and Rhode Island, and the common denominator is we don't have the funds to build more housing. We don't have the funds to provide more support. And, so like it's tough because like, yeah, I see like there's paths, but that's where the advocacy work comes in, right? It's getting into those spaces. So, for housing is a great example. So we could get into the housing, communities and educate people about housing because basic conversation. We started this conversation about, there's well-intended people that want to do good. And when you start having conversations, you have to start like having them understand disability as a different concept. So I'm talking to this one person and, I'm like, well, this is what inclusive house would look like. Well, what about these residential homes? I'm like, well, do you call that inclusion when it's 3 or 4 people with disabilities all living under one roof together? Like, that's not inclusion. And like, oh yeah, like it's like aha moments. So we need to do a better job with the disability world, educating people on the housing world. But then we got to start educating people in the disability world about housing and how do you advocate for housing. And even this one option that we're trying to develop, people are like, well, I didn't even know that's a possibility. Well, let's talk about that possibility. Let's kind of move towards it. This is what we need. What's universal design for housing? What's, ADA dwelling units and, there's so many different things that we could educate on, and we're not doing that. So it has to be this twofold conversation. So we could bring back to one community and educate another, so we could start working together. They're speaking different languages.
I like that you keep using the word educate people. How do you guys get your message out? Like as an organization, do you guys have like your own podcast, for example, or
I
do you guys
wish, yeah.
newsletter? Do you, like
Yeah.
everybody has a different way to carry their message, but like how are you guys doing it?
This helps.
Yeah.
Doing things like this. We have a social media page that needs to grow, and this is part of like being like there's some areas that I see we need to grow. We have newsletters. We go to events, word of mouth, things like that. But I think we need to do a better job with message and going going in different communities. And I think it's more than just having a website or a podcast. I think we actually have to just enter these spaces and just talk. And I'm so sick of social media and interwebs and things
Yes.
like that. And I think, you could have a conversation a lot better in person than you have on a comment feed post.
I think that's something I've heard so much this year and even last year. The concept of meeting people where they are.
Yeah.
And I think we need that more than ever because we have gotten locked into the digital space, where, oh, I'll just drop it off on Facebook. Somebody will see it. But there's no follow up. There's no, did you get that? Do you understand that? Do you want to be involved? Right? Like
Yeah.
somebody needs to come back around and kind of get that person. How do people get involved with your organization? Like not just work there, but like how can they contribute? How can they be a part of it?
Come to our trainings, come to our events, reach out, like get to know us. And I think that's something that we're still trying to figure out a little bit more. And we want members, we want allies, we want people with disabilities, and we're not just a disability organization. We focus on disability, but we know it's going to be a fully inclusive experience too. Like we don't want just one voice or another. And, you know, um, and I think sometimes too, like when we're entering new spaces, people start hearing more about us and then they want to work with us more. Now they're reaching out. So it's helped coming organically. This summer, I'll flag this for you. We're doing a disability pride parade and festival.
Oh,
Last year we did, we've had it in the past. In the past, it was labeled a disability justice parade and it was in October, but we redid it or revamped it last year to make it more of a pride parade for Disability Pride Month. And we went from about 60, 70 people at that event to about 400 last year. So hopefully this year we'll double that and double that. And so that's the summer, July 18th.
okay. Is it down? Oh, where is it?
Concord.
Okay. So up for me. It's up.
So, last year we had like Positive Street Art we love Positive Street Art. Have you heard of them before?
No, I have not.
Oh my God, you gotta,
I want to know more though. So I will look up.
they do some really cool stuff.
Okay.
Yaz and her team there are they're amazing. But we had an art project with them at the event. We also had a guide dog puppy kissing booth, which was really cute. And this year we're having a mobile dental unit come, and so also we want to make it like more of a festival and resource fair too.
Yeah.
And we highlight kids and youth speakers. So that things like that, we're showing up and we're talking about disability and we're having conversations that disability is a form of diversity, which I think is helping. I think when you see commercials from like Autism Speaks and some of these other larger organizations. It's the poor child with disability. Please give us money to support these programs.
It was Sarah McLachlan,
Yeah, but
music in
but
the
that's
background.
real. It's
Yeah, yeah,
real,
no,
and that's part of that conversation where that's how we view disability as a charity case.
yeah.
Which is not like we shouldn't be begging for money, and and it's how we reframe things, right? Like when Autism Speaks has the poor child that's nonverbal, like on their screen, like we need more money, please help us. Like, what does that do for a whole community?
That's across the board too.
Yeah,
I really think like just as a nation,
yeah,
we all need to come to the table and say, this is what we want to use our
yeah,
funds for. This is where we want to invest. The people just don't get that conversation, right? It's a certain group of people that tell us what they're willing to fund, and that conversation needs a shift.
yeah. We need to be, and I think our community needs to be louder
Yeah.
about it and well with it.
Absolutely. We're going to wrap up here. I think we're towards the end. I want to give you the last word. I want people to know how they can reach you.
Yeah.
I want them to know how they can get involved. Anything that you want to put out there. And in the description below, I'm going to put whatever links that help direct people and that you want me to put in there. So please.
Yeah. This is a hard one. I think where the take home for this would be, disability is diversity. And, we are part of communities and we are part of, of the story of our country. Look at like the civil rights movements in the 60s and the women's rights movements. What followed was a disability rights movement. I would like to see more of us being included into these type of conversations and appreciating the rights and the fight that so many people before me and so many people after us are going to have to put up with and continue to do so. So, appreciate disability for what it is, as a form of diversity, and going to keep fighting and forward with it. And in terms of how to best reach me, lewis@ablenh.org is my email, our website, ablenh.org, and, find us on, Facebook and Instagram, and we're trying to get a TikTok up. Eventually we'll get there. But if you have time and you want to come to a really fun event, July 18th at the State House in Concord, we're taking over the little area for our parade and festival from 10 to 1 o'clock. We're going to have disability organizations along with education and equity groups together and just talking about and having fun and being together. This is an uplifting, I don't want to like take over and take over the streets type event. Like I want our community to be there and be proud of who we are. And this is what this event's all about.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for, inviting me. And
oh, absolutely. I absolutely love the message. I love what you guys are doing. I'm just thankful that you took time. You came all the way out here to sit with me in person. Not doing this on Zoom, I feel like it just has a very different vibe.
Yeah.
And it's just as easy to just link up and then record it and put it on. But this is different.
Yeah.
So
I appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you too.